They sure do.
Ours is suggested class activity.
There you go.
Well, my little old mama got on a trip with the Red Sea United Methodist women, and they went. And I tell you what, when she came back, she could have went to work for them. I'm just seeing the videos. If we ever want to watch the video, we can. But
yep. Ken Ham's awesome. He really is. He's done a really good job, I understand.
Lady folks, discuss it. Men folks, we show up meeting.
that's a real.
The key thing, we went through it a few years back. Key thing about it, they have two theories. They got the scientific theory and they got the biblical theory.
Yeah.
They have boards on it. You can compare the two.
It's good. All right.
We need to pray. Another word.
Do you remember my two friends we were praying for, Linda and Glinda? Linda passed on this week, but please keep Glinda in prayer.
Is that health?
Cancer.
Another word. Ed, lead us in prayer.
Father, we thank you for this opportunity to be in your house once again. We thank you for this day that we set aside to honor those who have given their lives in order to secure the freedoms that we have. We pray now that you would be with each one of these requests that's been voiced to us this morning, and we pray for your perfect will to be done in each one. Pray especially for Kenan as he opens his word this morning. Pray our hearts will be open, receptive to those things we need to hear. In Christ we pray.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. All right. I thought it'd be fitting to take a little break from our doctrinal study. Pat said yes. Thank you very much. She's, yeah, you can thank her after class. We've been working through. Last week was election, the doctrine of election. That's a tough one, and I get it. This stuff gives me brain cramps too. Don't worry. I mean, it's tough stuff. But again, as you're talking with your friends from a certain church down the road, sometimes you're going to get into it about these quote doctrines of grace and the Reformed theology. So you should, when we're done with this, you should be able to handle it pretty well. I hope. But anyway, so I do want to talk about Memorial Day. Obviously, the verse that I've got picked out for us is one that we all know. The verses here, the verse 13 is the one I want to focus on. But Jesus said, "This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you." And then this is the verse: "Greater love has no man than this, that one lay down his life for his friends." That's a verse that I see a lot online, Facebook posts and such about Memorial Day. Just talk about a little bit about my grandfather. He did not die in the service; he died after the service. But it was one of the first times for me that I really understood the importance of having Memorial Day. He died in 1982. He was on a destroyer escort named the Ketchmer. Spent most of his time in the North Atlantic dodging Stukas, dive bombers that were coming overhead, trying to strafe them and trying to take them out as they were trying to escort ships over from New York over to ports in the United Kingdom, I'll say. Not only England, but also everything around there. And there were some close calls, obviously, with that. And he ended up in the Pacific right before the Japanese surrendered. They were getting ready to make their assault on Japan, and so they were marshaling all the forces when the bomb was dropped, of course, and Japan surrendered. Thank God for that. But when I was a sophomore in college, he had recently surrendered to gospel ministry. He died of lung cancer. Now, thankfully, he came to Christ before he died, and got a chance, of course, when he came home from the war. I think it was 46. that he had a family, actually 3 kids. You only see 2 there. Bessie's my mom. They called her Bossy Bessie, and for a good reason. I told you a little bit about her on Mother's Day, so I give and then I'm taking away. But anyway, no, she's just a wonderful lady. But yeah, he served his country, and when we did the funeral out at Hamlin Memory Gardens, of course, his coffin was draped with the flag, and the flag was presented to my grandmother, Neva, and it was a moving service, and that was really as a college student getting ready to go into ministry. That was a moving service to see all that, to see the guys from the American Legion come out and honor my grandfather. Of course, he also got a letter or certificate. The family did, that was signed by Ronald Reagan, which was kind of neat. He just happened to die during Reagan's presidency, and that was really cool. And that flag and that certificate are now proudly displayed in my office back in D.C. And I tell people about my grandfather and about his service. And every Memorial Day, my mom makes a trip up to Hamlin Memory Gardens, and she'll put a flower and put a flag, a fresh one, at my grandfather's grave, and she's planning on doing that Monday, and we're going to go. So, but apparently we're going to be one of a very dwindling few that are doing stuff like that anymore. There was a poll that was recently taken, a Harris poll. 55%, I think, Troy, to your point, they don't even know what it's about. They don't even know what Memorial Day is, what it's for. Okay, 55% of Americans can explain what it's about, and then further, only 1 in 5 plan to celebrate it in a particular way, other than burgers, dogs, and maybe a prayer. Only 1 in 5 are planning on a serious celebration about it. Now, if you want to know why that's significant, you need to look at the next generation coming up, because that's kind of scary. Half of them, according to a poll, and I didn't put the poll number up here, but right at half are not proud to be Americans, quite frankly. Why? Because they've been taught that America is terrible, that we're to blame for all the problems in the world, and that the Founding Fathers are evil, and they want to pull down all the statues. It's crazy. General Boykin, of course, that's my boss, that's my CO up in D.C., 3-star, retired, 36 and a half years in the U.S. Army. And he said this, he said, if you stop and think about it, what Memorial Day is all about is honoring those who gave the last full measure, quoting Lincoln, last full measure of their devotion, honoring those who died fighting for this country. He said, if young adults really knew what a sacrifice that's been made by those men and women that have stepped up and said, here I am, send me, Isaiah 6, by giving their lives in service to this country, they'd certainly have more pride. I agree. And again, sadly, the reason they've never been taught anything except what's wrong with our country and how our heroes are not only flawed but evil, but the truth is, for more than 244 years, American men and women have given their lives to a cause greater than themselves, the cause of liberty, right? And when we lose sight of what that cause is, there's really no reason to make such a costly sacrifice. So we need to be praying for this next generation. We need to be passing the torch of freedom to the next generation. And thankfully some of you are doing that in a very real way. But that's what we need to do. In fact, Ronald Reagan said this way back in the day, a couple of years before I was born. He said, freedom's never one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. He said, or one day we'll spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. True words, right? Wow. So, what about Memorial Day? Well, just real quick, it began, of course, during the Civil War. One tale is that it was down in Mississippi. where some Southern women scattered spring flowers on the graves of both Northern Union and Southern Confederate soldiers, both. They called it Decoration Day, right? In fact, years ago, that's what they called it. Still called it that. You remember that when you were growing up as a kid? And in the war between the states, of course, over 500,000 died, some 600,000 plus, and many places claimed to be the first. They had the first Decoration Day, and I've got all the places who have a claim to fame as the first place, and I'm not going to debate that right now. It ain't worth it. But I'm just showing you, if you Google where did Memorial Day begin, you're going to find all these different answers from all these different people. But I thought it was pretty significant. Charleston, South Carolina. This happened on May 1st, 1865. Mass grave of Union soldiers who had died in a prison camp were discovered, and former slaves took their bodies and reburied them. That was incredible. As an act of repatriation. Have you heard that word recently used in the media? Repatriation, paying reparations. It's a word that's kind of close to what's being used in the media. Anyway, so I thought that was kind of unique, a unique way, early way that it was celebrated, and that those who gave the ultimate sacrifice were honored in that way. But we've been honoring those who've died for the cause of freedom since the very beginning of our nation. I mean, you go all the way back to 1775, April 19, Lexington Green, very first shots that were fired in the War for Independence, right there in the shadow of a church. I know you can't hardly see that right there, that little box building right there, but that was their church, that was their meeting house. Jonas Clark was a pastor, and in that battle, you had, eventually by the end of the day, you had about 700 to 800 troops that were backed up by reinforcements at the end of the day, totaling about 1,500. But this, at the morning of April 19, 1775, the very first action, there were probably 300 plus that came around that church, as you see rendered in the painting there, 300, and there were 67 patriots that mustered at the alarm bell. 67. And Captain John Parker, who was in command of the group, said, disperse. We're outnumbered. I mean, he had said, don't fire unless fired upon. If they mean to have a war, let it begin here. That's what he said. But once he saw that he was outnumbered to that degree, he said, guys, disperse. The British were yelling, disperse. But in the confusion, one of the British soldiers shot a pistol. And then that led to some volleys being fired. And there were 8 of the men of Lexington who were killed in that first action that we would call the very first battle in the War for Independence. One of the guys, Caleb Harrington, came out of the church and they shot him. Another guy was trying to make it to his house and they shot him in the back, and he died in the arms of his wife and with his children watching on. So 8 were laid on the altar of freedom in the very first battle in the War for Independence. But what I want you to see is the fact that they remembered them. They had a memorial service. They did it to begin with on the day of. This happened like 5:45, 5:50 in the morning. By 10 a.m. they'd already had their very first service. They wanted to very quickly bury them because they didn't want them digging them up, and they thought maybe they would dig the bodies up and make sport with them. They didn't know what they were going to do. But on the 1-year anniversary, the pastor of those men who died in that first action preached a memorial sermon. And here's what he said. He said, on the morning of the 19th, they entered this town, and in this place, where this is the place where the fatal scene begins, they approach with the morning's light. They draw the sword of violence upon the inhabitants of this town, and with the cruelty and barbarity which should have been made the most hardened savage blush, they shed innocent blood. But oh my God, how shall I speak, or how How describe the distress, the horror of that awful morn, that gloomy day? Yonder field can witness the innocent blood of our brethren slain, and from thence does their blood cry unto God for vengeance from the ground. There the tender father bled, there the beloved son, there the hoary head, there the blooming youth, the old man, the young man, together, dying together in battle, and there the man in his full strength, and there with the man of years. They bleed, they die, not in their own cause only, but in the cause of this whole people, talking about America, in the cause of God, their country and posterity. And they've not bled, they shall not bleed in vain. Surely there's one that avengeth, and that will plead the cause of the injured and the oppressed, and in his own way and time will both cleanse and avenge their innocent blood. And the names of Monroe, Parker, and others that fell victims to the rage of the bloodthirsty oppressors, he's talking about the British, on that gloomy morning, shall be had in grateful remembrance by the people of this land, and transmitted to posterity with honor and respect through all generations. And may this day be remembered to the glory of God and our own instruction and improvement so long as we live. And then he concluded, he said, from the 19th of April, 1775, we may venture to predict in future history the liberty or the slavery of the American world. That was prophetic because he was right. That was the beginning of the War for Independence, right there in the shadow of his church house. And the first to lay their lives on the altar of sacrifice were 8 people out of his church. Well, there's a lot of letters that have been written back home to loved ones by these people who gave so much for our country. And I just want to share a few as we work our way through the wars that we've been involved in. And this is one from Continental Soldier James Williams. He said, this first chance I've had to write to you, I'm by the cause of providence. He's talking about God there in the field in defense of my country. He went on to express how deeply he missed his 8 kids, can you imagine? And their mother, who sits like a dove that has lost its mate, having the weight of the family on her shoulders. And he described the accidental death of a fellow soldier. Then he concluded that uncertainty of life ought to induce every man to prepare for death. Well, he died at the Battle of Kings Mountain in South Carolina right after writing this letter to his wife. And that was the last time he would communicate with his loved ones. Well, obviously in the Civil War we've got a lot more letters that we can draw from. Here's one. John Ross Waller, 15 years old when he signed up to be a drummer boy in the war. And he was dyslexic. He had a hard time writing, so he actually had to dictate the letter as he was actually dying. He'd been shot in the leg. He was languishing in a military hospital for days. And from his bed, he dictated this short letter to his family before he died. He said, "Dear sister, father, mother, and friends, I received your letter, but I don't think I'll ever see another that you write. This is Friday night, but I don't think I will live to see morning. But my kind friends, I'm a soldier of Christ. I'll meet you all in heaven." All kind of misspell words. Sorry, it's hard for me to read. "My leg has been taken above my knee." In other words, they cut his leg off at the knee. "And I'm dying at this time. So don't mourn after me, for I've bled and died for my country. May God help you all to pray for me. I want you all to meet me in heaven above, for I won't live till morning. So goodbye, my friends. May God be with you. May God be with you all. Goodbye. God bless my poor soul." And that was it. His last words. And then this from a field camp, Camp Clark, right outside of Washington, July 1861. Major Sullivan Ballou, he writes his loving wife a week before his death, Here's an excerpt. He said, I can't describe to you my feelings on this calm summer night when 2,000 men are sleeping around me, many of them enjoying the last, perhaps before that, of death. And I, suspicious that death is creeping behind me with his fatal dart, am communing with God, my country, and thee. I've sought most closely and diligently, and have often in my breast for a wrong motive, in thus hazarding the happiness of those I loved, and I could not find one. A pure love of my country and the principles is often advocated before the people, and the name of honor that I love more than I fear death have called upon me, and I've obeyed. Sarah, my love for you is deathless. It seems to bind me to you with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence could break. And yet my love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me irresistibly on with all these chains to the battlefield. The memories of blissful moments that I've spent with you come creeping over me, and I feel most gratified to God and to you that I've enjoyed them so long. And hard it is for me to give them up and to burn to ashes the hopes of future years when, God willing, we might still have lived and loved together and seen our sons grow up to honorable manhood around us. I have, I know, but a few small claims upon divine providence. But something whispers to me, perhaps it's the wafted prayer of my little Edgar, that I shall return to my loved ones unharmed. If I do not, my dear Sarah, never forget how much I love you. When my last breath escapes me on the battlefield, it will whisper your name. And that was the last that Sarah heard from her husband, who gave his life in service to a higher cause. Well, Memorial Day kind of took on a life after the Civil War. Here's one instance of what happened with all these popping up around the country. General John Logan, Civil War Veterans Organization, the Grand Army of the Republic, called for Decoration Day to have a specific date, which was May 30th. And of course, President James Garfield, his only executive order had to do with May 30th, decorate the graves of their loved ones who had died in service to their country. And then we come to World War I. And here's a letter that was written by Sergeant David Kerr, September 11, 1918. He was a Columbia University student who dropped out of college to fight in the war. He sent a letter to his mother the day before the attack on Saint-Mihiel in France. And while some troops consider it bad luck to write one of these "in case I die" letters, he just felt like he had to do it. So he wanted his mother, his sister Elizabeth, his fiancée Mary to keep their spirits up no matter the outcome. And so here's what he wrote. He said, tomorrow, the first totally American drive commences. We came into war late. If you remember, World War I is 1918, before we really got out there and got on the field. So the first totally American drive commences, and it gives me an inexpressible joy and pride to know that I shall be present to do my share. Should I go under, therefore, I want you to know that I went without any terror of death, and that my chief worry is the grief my death will bring to those dear to me. Since having found myself in Mary, there has been so much to make life sweet and glorious, but death, while distasteful, is in no way terrible. I feel wonderfully strong to do my share well, and for my sake, you must try to drown your sorrow in the pride and satisfaction, the knowledge that I died well in so clean a cause as ours should bring you. Remember how proud I've always been of your superb pluck. Keep Elizabeth's future in mind, and don't permit my death to bow your head. My personal belongings will all be sent to you. Your good taste will tell you which to send to Mary, his fiancée. May God bless and keep you, dear heart, and be kind to little Elizabeth and those others I love so well. David. The Americans broke through the German lines, but suffered 7,000 casualties in that battle, that 3-day offensive. And 21-year-old David Kerr was among those who gave his life for the cause of freedom. During World War I, you'll probably remember this when I get into it. John McCrae, he was a Canadian expeditionary gunner and medical officer. He fought during the Second Battle of Ypres, I guess is how you say that name, I don't know. Flanders, it's right outside of Flanders, Belgium. You will know that name, okay? And describing the battle as a nightmare, here's what he wrote about what he was experiencing out there. For 17 days and 70 nights, none of us had our clothes off, not our boots even, except occasionally. And all that time while I was awake, gunfire and rifle fire never ceased for 60 seconds. And behind it all was a constant background of the sights of the dead, the wounded, the maimed, and a terrible anxiety lest the line should give way. Remember the trench warfare, mustard gas, the whole deal. Chlorine attack, I think, was a part of what they were dealing with in this case. And finding one of his friends killed, John McCrae helped bury him along with the other dead in the field. And the field was covered with poppies. Exactly. You notice that that's the flower that a lot of people use for Memorial Day. And this is why, because he's the one who wrote this poem in Flanders Fields. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, beneath the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. But then there's a word for us. Take up your quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. 1921, Warren G. Harding had the remains of an unknown soldier killed in France during World War I buried in the tomb of what we call the unknown soldier. They didn't know who he was. And they put on the inscription, if you've been there, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." Now, since 1921, it's been the tradition for presidents to lay a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier, which is guarded 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I've been in there, out there in some really nasty weather. Those guys don't flinch. They don't budge. The precision as you watch them do what they do. The number 21 being the highest salute, that sentry takes 21 steps, faces the tomb for 21 seconds, turns and pauses 21 seconds, then retraces his steps again and again and again until that guard is changed, and that guy does it. And then that guy does it. And then that guy does it. It's always a constant vigil at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Of course, as you know, in 1958, President Eisenhower placed soldiers in the tomb from World War II and the Korean War who were unknown. And then in 1984, President Ronald Reagan placed a soldier from the Vietnam War in that tomb, but they did DNA evidence on that guy, found out who he was, and he's ended up being buried in those folks were buried there at the tomb of the unknown soldier. And that tradition started right after World War I. Let me move on to World War II real quick. And a letter that was written by J.M. Smith, one of three brothers who were serving. You know, the Saving Private Ryan fictional story. Well, there were actually three guys who were brothers who were serving, and a brother-in-law. The brother of the wife that J.M. Smith is writing in the letter I'm going to share with you. So all these guys, there's four guys, one of them makes it out alive. Only one. Captain Clark Smith. Remember that movie Back to Bataan? Remember that movie? The Death March? Does this ring a bell with anybody? Oh my goodness. Well, anyway, this is 6 weeks before the surrender J.M., the father of 2 little girls. Patricia had been born while he was away. Judy was not yet 2. Wrote to his wife Martha in Clovis, New Mexico. And man, this right after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese just launched attacks all the way around the South Pacific. So the U.S. forces stationed in the Philippines that were commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, they found themselves overrun really quickly. And you remember MacArthur then went to Australia, right? But he said, I shall return. Okay, somebody knows some history a little bit around here. Okay, good. Glad to know that. But the fighting continued until the Americans and the Filipinos were forced to surrender on April 9. And by that time, the men were so emaciated and dehydrated. They were sick, dysentery, malaria, the whole deal. They were barely living. But the worst was yet to come on that 65-mile forced march by the Japanese to a railway junction without food, water, medicine, nothing. And of course, all kinds of them, 10,000, including British and Australian soldiers, died along the way. And those who survived spent the next 3 years as prisoners of war. And again, these brothers were in the midst of it, except for Clark. Clark escaped to Corregidor and lived in the tunnels until the end of the war, barely living. But here's what the father of the 2 kids, wife named Martha, wrote on February 22nd, 1942. He said, "My sweet, well, darling, life's been good to us and God has surely been with us in many ways. And if we carry on as we have in the past, He will stay in our hearts and by our side as long as there's a need of Him. So I opened my letter asking His blessings for you all." Notice how faith plays a role in pretty much everybody. I tell you what, you have some conversion experiences in foxholes, I'm sure. But in a prisoner of war camp, people are talking about God. They're pretty serious about God. So is this guy. And hopefully it's genuine. He says, I know you've suffered and grieved many times since I've left, but chin up, look at the world in the face, for you have 2 of the sweetest things in the world to brighten your life. Those kids, God bless them. I miss you all so much. But with God's will, I'll return someday, and that in itself is all we could ask of anyone. The boys are in high spirit, talking about the guys around him, and there could never be any equal to these fellas, all of them. I mean soldiers here in Bataan. You would never know what it could be like unless you were here. Kind of between the lines she's having to read. It's really bad, but he's trying to keep her spirits high. Do you see it? And look at what he does. Jim, Martha's brother, is my battery commander, so now I see him every day. Clark's feeling very well. He's the guy that escaped. Bernie is okay, the brother, but they said they sure would like to see the squirts, the 2 kids. Did Judy have a big Christmas? I wanted to be there so much, and I wanted her to have a big Christmas. And if I ever get home, I'll sure throw a big party for y'all. But my sweet, you know I miss you very much, and I would give anything under the sun to be with you. But I'm not, so just have faith in me and in God. And I'll be home someday. I could write a lot of nonsense and a lot of foolishness, but I know you'll read between the lines and see more in the Spirit than in what I write. God bless you all, and I pray that He keeps you well and happy. I love you all. J.M. Martha Smith never heard from her husband or her brother Jim. Bernie Smith was also killed. Again, Clark was the only one that made it out and survived the war. That was the last time she heard from her husband. Well, Korean War, we also have some letters that were the last letters home, if you will. Here's one from Captain Moulton Schuler, who wrote his wife back in South Carolina about a makeshift church that he and the 45th Infantry Division put together so they could worship the Lord in the middle of a battle that was going on. It was crazy. Chore 1 was happening, and there was all kinds of bombing raids going on while they're sitting there trying to worship the Lord in a makeshift church. But here's what he writes his wife, Helen. Helen, my darling, You are perfection, the paragon of womanhood, and you're my wife, and I adore you. And what's more, your 6 letters came today, and with them came my very life. For my heart was slowly breaking for words of love and tenderness from you, my beloved wife. It's impossible to describe what your letters meant to be. More than you can possibly imagine, I appreciate your love. I know full well you love me, but I can't see quite why. But I'm not going to quibble. I'm only going to love you more for loving me as you do. Then there's another reason for my good spirits tonight. As if your letters weren't enough, I went to church tonight. Let me paint a word picture for you for the church. Picture a grassy hillside surrounded by mountains and a rugged-looking crew haircut and all. Chaplain blessed in fatigues, standing by a government-issue folding podium with a red velvet cover and a brass candelabra minus the candles, all placed on a couple of ammo boxes. Then just left of the pulpit, as you face it, you find a battered 30-odd key olive drab organ, a GI pianist sitting on a 5-gallon gasoline can, and in the background you find blasted Chinese bunkers and old gun emplacements. Then if you look your way to the left, you'll see a battery of 605 howitzers, their ugly muzzles pointed menacingly toward the north. And to the right and on up the valley are bunkers of our company, a couple of tents from which the winds erode one way behind our church. But what about the pews and who occupies them? Well, they're roughly terraced rows with a handful of soldiers, mostly a little dirty and bedraggled, trying to keep from becoming more soiled by sitting on their helmets. You find a rifle loaded with a full clip or a carbine with jam-packed magazine beside each man. And over there is a blonde and a baby-faced young man. Beside him is a tough-looking hombre with a dark beard and dirty fingernails. And down in the front row are 3 Korean boys who just sang a couple of hymns in their native tongue, self-conscious to be sure, but even so attesting to God's presence in the hearts of a people torn by war. And God's in this chapel, so near you could almost reach out and touch Him. And the chaplain says, "And men, in the days to come, you must remember the words of Christ when asked where He lived. Come and see." Only a couple times in my life before this evening, I felt God's presence in such a way. Perhaps it was the place and the time, I don't know. Be that as it may, I like the way I felt. Excuse me for trying to be literary, I didn't mean to, as my efforts no doubt reveal. Good night, dear. Love the children for me, and miss me, please. Your man always, Molt. 3 weeks later, she got another letter about him being wounded in the battle. She didn't know that UN soldiers at Chirwan had found themselves overwhelmed 3-1 by Chinese troops. And that's what happened. I mean, we were doing okay till the Chinese got involved. They just completely outnumbered us. But Captain Schuler was hit by shrapnel in the neck, in the back, and on his right leg. He was evac to a MASH unit, and they took him to Tokyo, where he got a blood infection, died August 24th, 1952. And that was the last time that his wife heard from him. And then there are the letters from Vietnam. I thought these were pretty interesting, from Private First Class Timothy Robinson, Hoyt Lakes, Minnesota. The spelling is really fun, so bear with me if I stumble a little bit with this, but he chronicles his combat experience in Vietnam during March and April of 1968. Here's what he first wrote, March 28th. He said, "The good Lord was with me coming down the hill because I wasn't hit, but some of the men in front of me and alongside me were hit. Death is sad over here to these young men, to see them rolled up in a poncho. I had to go out and get one guy that got hit and then got on fire, and he was still burning when we got to him. It was a sad mess. I've never been so scared in my life as I was that day, and I've been praying ever since that day." And then on April 14, he wrote his family back home. "Right now, I'm sitting in front of my bunker pulling guard, and it's 2 a.m. In the morning, which would make it 12 o'clock afternoon, April 13 at home. It's light out tonight, so I can see to write." He said, "I hope the Easter Bunny doesn't forget me this year, because the last 21 years It's been real good to me and will always be so dear to my heart. Right, Mom? He said, remember when we were kids on Easter, the girls would be all dressed up in their new hats and pretty dresses and new gloves, and us boys with new shoes and shirts off to church. We'd go and after come back and look for our Easter baskets. What good times. I hope God will bring me back home so I may marry the girl I love, which will be March if things go okay. Then I can watch my kids all dress up and head for church and live them days over again. Today we went out on patrol and it wasn't good for an Easter Sunday. One man tripped off a booby trap and exploded a 105 millimeter round, killed himself and wounded another. Holidays are no different than any other day. Every day is Monday in Vietnam. Just about every day we walk between 3 to 12 miles through rice paddies up to our knees in mud, up and down the hills, through jungles. What a drag. It's 1968. Yeah, he said, must go now. God be with you all. Your fighting son and brother Tim. The special care packages that the family sent him were returned several weeks later, and on April 19, 1968, he caught his foot on a tripwire that led to a booby trap that completely disintegrated this man. There wasn't anything left to ship back home except a flag. It was during that war that Charles Michael Province wrote this little poem. It's a soldier, not the minister, who's given us freedom of religion. It's a soldier, not the reporter, who's given us freedom of the press. It's a soldier, not the poet, who's given us freedom of speech. It's a soldier, not the campus organizer, who's given us the freedom to protest. Remember that during the Vietnam War? It's a soldier, not the lawyer, who's given us the right to a fair trial. It's a soldier, not the politician, who's given us the right to vote. It's the soldier who salutes the flag, who serves beneath the flag, and whose coffin is draped by the flag, who allows the protester to burn the flag. One more, if you'll bear with me. During that second Gulf War, I guess we'd call it the Iraq War, Army Private First Class Jesse Givens, Carson, Colorado, wrote to his wife Melissa, who was expecting their second child, and he wrote with a sense of foreboding, sure that he would never see her, his son Dakota, or the child that was on the way that he affectionately called Bean. Little Bean. He instructed his wife not to open the letter unless he died. Well, here's the letter. April 22nd, 2003. My family. I never thought I'd be writing a letter like this. I really don't know where to start. I've been getting bad feelings, though, and, well, if you're reading this, ... I'm forever in debt to you, Dakota and the Bean. I searched all my life for a dream, and I found it in you. I'd like to think that I made a positive difference. I'll never be able to make up for the bad. I'm so sorry. The happiest moments in my life all deal with my little family. I'll always have with me the small moments we all shared. The moments when you quit taking life so serious and smiled. The sounds of a beautiful boy's laughter, the simple nudge of a baby unborn. You'll never know how complete you've made me, each one of you. Dakota, you're more son than I could ever ask for. I can only hope that I was half the dad. You taught me how to care until it hurts. You taught me how to smile again. You taught me that life isn't so serious and sometimes you have to play. I'll always be there in our park when you dream so we can still play. I hope someday you'll have a son like mine. Make them smile and shine just like you. I love you, Toad. I hope someday you'll understand why I didn't come home. Please be proud of me. Don't stop loving life. Take in every breath like it's your first. I love you, Toad. I'll always be there with you. Be in the sun, shadows, dreams, and joys of your life. And then to the little unborn that he called Bean. Bean, I never got to see you, but I know in my heart that you're beautiful. I know you'll be strong and big-hearted like your mom and your brother. I will always have with me the feeling of the soft nudges on your mom's belly and the joy I felt when I found out you were on your way. I dream of you every night. I will always. Don't ever think that since I wasn't around that I didn't love you, for you were conceived of love, and I came to this terrible place for love. I love you as I do your mom and your brother with all my heart and soul. Please understand that I had to be gone so that I could take care of my family. I love you, Bean. I've never been so blessed as the day I met Melissa Dawn Benfield. You're my angel, soulmate, wife, lover, and best friend. I'm so sorry. Letter. There's so much more I need to say, so much more I need to share. A lifetime's worth. I married you for 1,000,000 lifetimes. It's how long I'll be with you. Please keep my baby safe. Please find it in your heart to forgive me for leaving you alone. Please take care of yourself and believe in yourself. You're strong. You're a big-hearted woman. Teach our babies to live life to the fullest. Tell yourself to do the same. I'll always be there with you, Melissa. I always want you and need you and love you in my heart, mind, and soul. Do me a favor after you tuck Toad and Bean in. Give them hugs and kisses from me. Go outside and look at the stars and count them. And don't forget to smile. Love always, your husband, Jess. On May 1st, 2003, Private Givens was driving an Abrams M1A2 tank right outside of Baghdad. The Iraqis had set on fire a ammo depot, and it was raging out of fire, and he was going over in the tank to see what was going on. And of course, he steered that 70-ton tank toward higher ground when the heat became too intense for his tank and the men inside. He had 3 other guys inside, but a berm collapsed. He was running alongside the Euphrates River, and the berm collapsed, and the tank went over into the Euphrates River in a backwater pool, and Private Givens drowned. 3-man crew, they made it out alive, but he was the guy. He knew. He wrote it in his letter. He had this sense of foreboding. He knew. And his letter was stained by the muddy river where he died, smeared his handwriting, obliterated the words at the end. Givens was 34 years old, and about the time that the letter arrived, Melissa gave birth to their second son, Carson, she named him. So many stories. So many stories. So many good men and women who've died serving this country. And as you know, Memorial Day grew into something that didn't just honor those in the Civil War, but all the wars. And as you can see, there have been a bunch of people who've laid their lives on the altar of freedom. And I don't know that anybody says it better than Ronald Reagan when it comes to honoring the men and women who served. He served himself, if you didn't know that. Read his history. Yeah, he was a movie star during the war too, but he did serve. And here's what he said on Memorial Day, 1982. It was actually May 31st, last day in the month. He said, I can't claim to know the words of all the national anthems in the world. I don't know of any other, though, that ends with a question and a challenge as ours does. Does that flag still wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? That is what we must all ask. The United States and the freedom for which it stands, the freedom for which they died, must endure and prosper. Their lives remind us that freedom is not bought cheaply. It has a cost. It imposes a burden. And just as they whom we commemorate were willing to sacrifice, so too must we, in a less final, less heroic way, be willing to give of ourselves. So as you celebrate tomorrow, as you commemorate the day, think about the reason why we have the freedom to worship in this place and have that day that we commemorate tomorrow. Let's pray. Father, we thank you We thank you so much for these brave men and women who put on that uniform, serve this country, and particularly for those who gave the last full measure of devotion and laid their lives as a sacrifice on the altar of freedom. God, forgive us for not helping this next generation who doesn't understand why America is so great. Forgive us for not teaching them and telling them when they're kids as they're coming up that yes, we have our flaws. We're not a perfect nation. But America is the greatest nation on the face of the earth, the most compassionate, the most free, the most prosperous, because your hand has blessed us. And because of the great sacrifices that have been made by these amazing people in our armed forces. God, we pray a blessing on their families. And we pray that we would do justice to their memory tomorrow. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. Have a great Memorial Day weekend here. Thanks for coming.